setup and pressing tips. Whether you sew clothes, you sew quilts, or you make handbags, any type of projects like that, I think these tips are going to come in handy. If you don't already use them, definitely give them a try. So let's make sure everything is working for us. Go ahead and let me know if you can see me and hear me. I am coming to y'all from my home sewing studio here in North Central Florida, where it is almost 90 degrees today, and my plants are loving it. Some of them, of course, not all of them. Hey, I see my old friend Judith is on. It's her son Bugsy. Hey, Bugsy, of course I remember you, my homeschool friends. All right, let's see who else is on. Hey, Tamara from Chicago. She says it was 52 degrees Fahrenheit on Monday and it's 15 today, but at least it's sunny. My goodness. We did have some temperatures in the low 20s recently here. A lot of my stuff froze back and now our azaleas are blooming. I think a little early for us, but everybody's are just looking super pretty. All right, great. Joan can see me and hear me. Let's see who we have tuning in. Angie is tuning in from Northeast Georgia. That's a neighbor to the north. Marilyn in the house from Melbourne, Florida. That's a neighbor to the south. Hey, Debbie from California. Thanks for tuning in. We have Kathleen tuning in from Ontario, Canada, where she says it's cold, snowy, and icy. I'm sure that it is. I am so hot that I had to crank the AC down a little bit. I took a cold shower and I have a cold, icy cup of water here. So you all can imagine what 86, 87 degrees feels like here in Florida. Still a little drier than normal, but I feel the humidity coming on for the spring already. Okay, so let's get started with the demo and the tip sharing for today. I am, first off, let me apologize for missing last week WIP Wednesday. I sprained my ankle. Unloading some packages with my husband onto the back porch. I stepped off the back porch with my left foot and stepped into a hole that my dogs had dug, and I rolled my ankle. But of course, stuff like that doesn't stop me. I wrapped it up, and 2 days later, we went salsa dancing, bachata dancing. So that was last Wednesday. And then let's go ahead and switch to my over-the-shoulder camera here. I'm going to try to avoid getting hit in the face with this rod. We changed up our camera setup a little bit. I prefer it on my left since I'm right-hand dominant. So hopefully this shows a little bit better for my demos and stuff. Only thing is I got to make sure I don't bump myself in the head. Okay. Here, apologies for my hand if you can see it. Here you can see all my veins and stuff. And this one is nice and puffy because I was inspecting our beehives a couple days ago and I didn't have my really good gloves, so I got stung here and it's still a bit swollen. But that doesn't stop me, but I know I'll get messages from people saying, hey, your hand looks different. All right, so first, I'm going to break up today's WIP Wednesday into 3 different sections having to do with pressing and ironing that I want to share tips on. So the first is going to be the surface that we're pressing our fabrics on, okay? So you all, if you have followed me for a long time, probably know that I tend to make my ironing board surfaces, especially for tutorials, because I want to be able to press really quick without having to change my entire camera setup to a larger pressing station. So these are some of the DIY versions. I have small ones, little ones, bigger ones, all kinds of stuff. And so I want to talk about this. If I press into this pressing mat, I shouldn't even say mat because it's really not a mat. I'll flip it over in a second and show you. Can you see how like nothing is going down? It's not soft at all to the touch. And so that's one of my first tips. I always like to press my seams, my hems, patchwork intersections if you do a lot of quilting, okay, where it's bulky. The harder the surface underneath, I feel like in my experience, the better and flatter the seam tends to turn out. If you are pressing on something really cushiony, it's like you can't get that hard surface underneath so that you can press against to help you get it flatter. So if you can see that, there's not like any soft, plush surface here. My stuff is nice and hard. And I'll flip it over and show you what I've done here. Of course, I don't really care how the bottom looks. I tend to replace the covering in the fabric a lot. Once you get like fusible adhesive on your fabric cover on this side, or you know, you get little bits of stuff and stains, I just rip it off, pull out the staples and refinish it. And so a couple tips if you are going to make your own DIY version. I do have a free tutorial on my YouTube channel where I made a little one years ago, maybe like 8 or 9 years ago, when my kids were toddlers and they had those wooden puzzles like those Melissa and Doug type of puzzles and stuff, after we would lose the pieces for them, I would flip it over and cover it with a couple layers of batting and then some fabric and just staple gun it all around. And so those were great little small DIY mini ironing boards that I could take when I traveled to retreats, if I was filming something out of town, all that kind of stuff, okay? So these were, I think I got these for the last cruise a couple years ago. I made a bunch of them because they were easy to set up and they fit inside a suitcase. These are just wooden boards that I got. I want to say it was at Michael's or Joann's, one of those. What you do want to try and get is something that's not been pressure treated, because the last thing you want is to be adding heat and moisture to something that has a bunch of toxic chemicals that is just going to be releasing into the air while you're in an enclosed space in a room pressing, okay? So I like to use just something that is just regular pine, or some type of a hardwood that can withstand the moisture of steam and heat. But then, as you can see, I just use whatever thick batting, and this is a good tip here. The batting that I tend to use will be the thickest 100% cotton batting that I have in my stash. You do not want to really be using synthetic or like 100% polyester batting for this, because it's not going to last. Even though it's covered with cotton fabric, it won't last. It'll just be, the hotter your iron and the more you press on it, the more it will just melt, and it'll become really, really thin underneath, and you're gonna, it's gonna kind of defeat the purpose of having a little bit of cushion or pushback on your DIY ironing board, okay? So use a wood that's sturdy, even, obviously, as even as you can get it. These have slats, so they're not that even, but because I wrapped it with that thicker batting, I find that it works fine. So I just wrapped it with one layer. If you don't have, like a plump cotton batting like this, I would just use multiple layers. So for example, here I have a sample piece of a batting that we carry in the shop. This is 100% cotton Quilter's Dream Select batting. And the select part references the weight or the loft, how thin or thick the batting is. Request is the thinner level. So that mid-range one is going to be called select. And this is a little bit thinner than this. So I would probably use 2 to 3 layers of a cotton batting. But again, use 100% cotton. If you want to if you're making some smaller boards like this, it would be helpful to maybe just get a small craft size package of a cotton batting, and that way you can cut it up and wrap it 2 or 3 layers of it around a smaller ironing board. And then I just take like a hand staple gun. If you're crafty and handy, you probably have one, and I just staple gun it to here. But I do it all together. Usually if the batting is like really big, I'll just wrap it, staple gun just the batting in a couple places to keep it nice and taut, and then I'll go in and same thing and just rough cut a chunk of fabric, enough with the wraparound to go over the batting and underneath the edges, and then I'll staple gun that too. So I just want cotton on wood with no chemicals. Okay, so those are your layers for your DIY ironing board. Mary's asking a good question. She says, what do you think of the wool pressing mats? So I have one. And I'm glad you actually brought that up. I'll need to dig around in all my pressing mat stash over here and bring it out again. I've used it a couple of times. For some reason, I like something stiffer. And it's like, those mats are like, what are they? Maybe the ones I have are 1/2 of an inch to 5/8 of an inch thick. I mean, they're solid felted wool mats, but I still feel like I want this right here. This hard surface, okay? Let me show you another option, because a lot of you have been watching us on WIP Wednesday and maybe have purchased one of these from us. This is that Martelli roundabout. It's made of 3 different levels. The top one is a cutting mat. And when you take that off, you probably have seen me press patchwork, curved patchwork pieces, or any small pieces when I'm demoing on this. This second layer is a little pressing mat. Okay, and then the bottom is the rotating part at the bottom. So if we look at this, I'm going to press it again like I showed you on the other one. This one has a little bit of a foamy feel to it, but still it's not like ironing on your bed, right? When you go to like, oh, really quick, let me iron a top or something, and you press on your bed and it's like so soft, like it's mattressy. I want something stiff and hard that I can press against with my iron to create that level underneath, the iron on top, and it's like squishing down my fabric to really set my stitches and press those seams as well as I want them to be, okay? So if we flip this over, Martelli makes this little, it has elastic, it looks like on the edge here that's serged into it, but look at the board. It's like a thin plywood board, And if I lift this back, you can see they've tucked in a thin layer of batting. And actually looking at this, I have been using this for a while now, maybe a year and a half or 2 years. And I can tell that it's about the same as my Quilter's Dream Select. So you can see that even one layer here works, but there's a couple other things. This fabric on top is cotton, but it's thicker than a quilting cotton, so it feels like a like a lightweight cotton canvas is what it feels like to me. They have the one layer of the batting, and then under here, this is glued to that thin plyboard sheet, and this is like a piece of foam that's obviously heat resistant, right? If they put it into the mat. So it has a little give, but not much. I mean, look at that. It's still a stiff um, uh, what do you call this? A stiff surface for you to press on. And I'm guessing, this is just my guess, that they put this on top because the plywood sheet is about 1/4 of an inch thick. This little foam thing that's glued to the top of it is 1/8 of an inch thick. And what I'm thinking this does is keeps the steam, right, the moisture from going into this thin plywood. Because if you know anything about working with thin woods, any type of moisture like that for something that is not pressure treated or painted or oiled and stuff, it's going to bust, right, the wood grain. So I'm guessing that that's why that is there, but it still leaves it with a slim profile for the finished ironing mat. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that so that you have some ideas, so that if you do want to make your own at home, you can kind of think along these lines. We want something solid that we can press against without it caving in, okay? Because what we want is crisp seams or folds, all right? Okay, Sue is saying that she uses the wool mat, and she says the wool mat along with a wooden pressing clapper works really great for me. One thing I will say also about the wool mat that doesn't bother me, but it may bother some people, is one, allergies. If you're allergic to wool, you probably won't be able to use it. But two is the smell. Like, I'm a knitter and I crochet and I work a lot and I spin yarn, and so that sheepy barn smell, I like it, but not everybody does. So just keep that in mind, because if you use steam on a wool mat, sometimes you get that kind of sheepy smell that I know people are like, oh my gosh, why does this smell so bad? But it's just wool. Okay, let me see my list here. So we talked about the ironing surface, great. Next up, let me take a sip of water and I will talk a little bit about irons, and I will share with you some of the ones that I've been using for a long time, and some things for you to look at and keep in mind when you're getting yours. Oh, Lindy, I hope you get better soon. She says she just had knee replacement surgery. She's doing great. That's good to hear. All right, hopefully you're back on your feet and sewing in no time, huh? Okay. Let's see. Just making sure I'm not missing any questions here. Tamara says she loves her Martelli mat. Awesome. It is pricey, but it really, when you have it, you find yourself using it more and more and more. Okay. Oh, and Janet says that her wool mat has several burns on it from a hot cotton iron. So yeah, we got to be careful with the heat on these irons, and we'll talk a little bit about that next. So here I pulled out 3 of the irons that I have probably used, not the most. I have one more. My cordless iron from Panasonic is another one that I have used quite a bit. This T-Fall one is my favorite. I have, I think, 4 of them, because once we got them, I bought a bunch for different retreats and to take on cruises. It just gets really, really hot, and I rarely have had, actually, I've never really had any issues with it, whether you put the water in it or you just leave it to be used as a hot dry iron. It gets really, really hot. So oftentimes I get emails from students who are making a project, and they'll say like, my adhesive on the fusible interfacing didn't stick like yours did, or I wasn't really able to get the crease for the hem in the project or whatever. And oftentimes it's the iron, because it doesn't get hot enough. So I will just say, I looked this up to get my Amazon affiliate link to share with you all. They, I don't think they're making this model anymore. This is the 1,725 watt version. I put a link in there for one, I think it's like 1,800 or 1,900 watts. So you should be good with that one too. The same T-Fall Ultra Glide, like ceramic coating for the iron version. It gets super, super hot. So the only thing you have to keep in mind is, yes, you will get amazing creases and seam intersections if you're just working with 100% cotton fabric on a cotton fabric thing with cotton batting, okay? Cotton, cotton, cotton on cotton, and it works really, really well. But if you have this iron or you're gonna get something like this, you don't wanna set it to the cotton, the linen cotton setting at the highest and think that you can hit like a double brush polyester spandex or something with it. You can definitely melt that fabric, you know, like synthetics, because it does get that hot. Now, some smaller travel size options are these two that I'm sure many of you who have been watching me for years. Ooh, I can barely fold my hand from this bee sting. I'm like trying to grab this. These two, I start off with this one maybe 13 years ago. Pros and cons, right, to everything. Cute little travel size. I have links to this in the video description of the YouTube channel. It does take steam. You open it here. You pour in a little bit of water. Obviously, the reservoir is not going to take that much, but it does have that option. It has a couple little holes here for steam to come out, and then the whole thing gets hot. So the only thing about this one, and it's probably the reason why I stopped using it after several years when I found other options, is that I have really large hands, and when I grab it here, I have to be super careful to not touch the bottom here. Even though this is coated in plastic and it's not the exposed metal of the sole plate, when you grab it, if your fingers touch here, whoo, this thing gets so hot, you're gonna burn yourself. So I have to really, with my big hands, kind of grab it really close to the top so that I don't burn myself. And it's quite a small handle. So many of you probably have this one. Let's see. Yeah, so Donna says that explains why the interfacing didn't stick. Absolutely. I mean, there could be different things. You know, you always want to check the manufacturer's instructions to see if they require steam when you're fusing interfacing. But most of the time, what I have seen is that the iron was not hot enough to get that adhesive to the melting point that it needs to be in order to fuse correctly, if that makes sense. All right. All right. And then this one is the next one up for the small travel size irons, retreat irons, that kind of stuff. This is my favorite one. And this one is by Sunbeam. Again, the link is in the video description box if you're watching us on YouTube. We can also go ahead and put that in the chat box for y'all. This one I like because although I have big hands, obviously it's a little bit bigger than this one, but if I grab it, it has these kind of dents right here that I can place my fingers on. And because that's where the water is, it stays cooler. So I don't have to worry about touching down here or touching the metal sole plate. This one, again, also like the other little one, has the holes here for steam. And you put the water in here if you are going to use that function and use water in the iron versus a little spray bottle, okay? And then min, max, you know, you have your different temperature settings. And if you want to give a blast of steam, it's kind of like a larger iron on a mini scale because you can leave the steam function on or off, and then you can give it a little blast by pressing these buttons on the these white buttons on the sides, okay? But we have used these plenty in different retreats, classes, when I used to teach kids and beginners and all that. Okay. Barb says, is it true that putting water in your iron will ruin it? I think that depends on the iron, the quality of the manufacturing of the iron, as well as the quality of your water. We have a well here since we live out in rural Florida, and our water is quite hard. So often I stay away from putting water in my irons. I know some people will buy like distilled water, they'll use this water, that water. I often tend to just fill up my little spray mist bottle here with water, just regular well water. And instead of having the water come out from my iron, what I do is I mist the fabric, the project, whatever I'm going to press. So I'm adding the moisture that way, like independently from the iron. Then I hit it with the heat of the iron. So when the heat of that sole plate of the iron hits the water that I've already sprayed, it creates the steam. So I get the same effect without having to worry about clogging up my iron or dealing with all the hard water minerals and all that. So that is an option if you do find that you have really hard water or for some reason your water, you know, just messes up your irons, okay? So keep that in mind. Now, Sally says, I'm thinking about getting a heat press. So I have several heat presses. Of course, I have all the gadgets. Several heat presses. Some of them you can steam, some you cannot. I think they're great. It just depends on the application and what you're doing, right? If you're just pressing little tiny little patchwork pieces like this size, it doesn't really make too much sense to have a huge heat press. They're pricey and they're more to get the work done quicker. They're super efficient, but they cover a lot more space than obviously one of these little irons or even my big T-fall will cover. So it just depends on, you know, the actual application, but I do think that a heat press can really come in handy. All right. Yeah, Mary Grace says she does that method. She uses the mist bottle with the dry iron. Okay, so We talked a little bit about irons. I shared these guys. Okay, I think that's good. So now let's move on to discussing the setting tools, specifically, dun dun dun, my most favorite must-have tool in my sewing studio, a wooden tailor's clapper. Now I have several of these. They make them in all different sizes, shapes, and I have found over the years that this one is my go-to favorite because it's long and slim. It's easy to hold right here, has these grooves. We do sell this in the online shop, okay? So the link for that is in the featured tab of our shop page or in the chat box and in the video description. We put the link there too. We've got some more in stock. So this is my favorite. If you are hemming garments, this comes in really handy because it's slim, but it's long. So if I'm hemming the bottom hem of a t-shirt that I've made using stretch knits, right? Say cotton spandex, I can cover a longer length of that hem by using this clapper that's long and narrow, okay? And it's lightweight. Some of the bigger ones can really kind of cumbersome to grip, like if they're wider like that, to have your hand all strained and wide to be holding and picking up. Some are even shorter, so it just takes more clapping to work your way down long seams or long hems. And so I found that this is just like the sweet spot in the middle of weight, price as well, because the bigger these are, the more expensive they get. And they're made in the US by Jackson Woodworks. It's a family-owned company. So those are the ones that we carry. Oh, I see all of y'all are saying it. The clapper is the bomb. Nancy says she loves her clapper. Mirta says she loves her clapper too. All right. Terry says, she had a Rowenta iron for 10 years and it was leaking. She says, I learned to never put water in her irons. I do what Vanessa does, the spray bottle, and that solved her issue. That used to happen to me too. I used to have Rowenta irons and they would all just leak for me. And then I found this T-Fall one and I switched over to this maybe about 7 years ago or so, just because I could have the option, right, to put water in or to use the spray bottle, and I haven't had any issues. So I switched to that a while back. Okay, let's see. Debbie was asking, does the Sunbeam model, which is this one, have a plate to rest on, or does it stand up like a regular size iron? Yeah, so it just has this little bit, like it just stands up like that. It doesn't have an actual thing underneath it. Now, we used to carry those silicone ironing pads. I don't think we have any in stock anymore, but we used to carry those silicone sole plate, it's like a shape of an iron with little raised silicone dots that you can also, if you're working on something where you're constantly ironing and you don't want to have to keep putting it up and down, then you can put it on those, okay? All right. Let's see. Okay, so let's move on to the patchwork part because I want to show you what I use the clapper for, and this is when we're going to talk about the press or the setting tools for pressing. So sometimes I will say if you're using a smaller iron and you don't have a clapper, you may have a tougher time getting a better crease, especially if you're working on or with a fabric that is partially synthetic. So if it's like a cotton, poly, and spandex blend, I find that the more weight the iron has, the better it is at setting the crease to heat it up first so that then I can follow it up with the clapper. So just keep that in mind, okay? Let's see, Barb is saying, let me see. Whoop, I lost it. Okay, well, let's move on. So I have a couple of little patchwork pieces here that I put together, a couple pins. Let's grab our sewing machine here. I'm going to sew up a seam and show you exactly how I use my clapper when I sew two pieces of cotton fabric together. I also went ahead and pulled up a couple of my stretch knit fabric. So I want to show you, for those of you that sew garments, how I use it in that, you know, when I'm working with that type of fabric, okay? So I don't want to mess with this camera too much, but I'm going to put that there. I'm going to sew two samples. We're going to do a 1/4 inch seam on one for you quilters out there to see how it works on a narrow seam. And then we'll do a chunkier one so you can see a little bit better, like the same application of the tailor's clapper on a larger scale. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on this machine. I'm working with my Juki LB5020. We do still have some of these in stock for those of you that were on the wait list before. and that is on the featured page of our shop page as well. I know we have a bunch of people on a wait list for the extension table that I shared last time. We sold out super quick on the LB5020 extension tables. We have some on order and we just need to go pick them up. So we'll be adding those back in stock soon. Just a heads up for those of you that are waiting for that. All right, so on this one, I tend to move my needle position. We'll set it there at 6. That looks about 1/4 of an inch. And then my seam, or the stitch length, excuse me, I'm going to leave it at 2 millimeters in length. So let's go ahead and take a couple stitches. I'm going to back stitch, and then we're just going to stitch this one seam up. Can back stitch at the end if we want to too. Why not? Grab my thread snips. Ooh, and that's a scant 1/4 inch. I went narrow on that one. And then on this one, let's put the needle back in the center position, and we're just going to sew a 1/2 inch seam. Or let's do a 5/8, because I know we may have some people here who sew garments and want to see, can they use a tailor's clapper on or woven fabrics when you're making garments. It works great. I use it both for woven fabrics and for my knit fabrics, whether or not they have synthetic in them. I just adjust the heat of the iron to accommodate whatever the synthetic fiber content may be in the fabric, okay? My pins. All right, so we have a nice, hard, sturdy ironing surface. Now I will say, remember I keep saying like something that has not much give at all. If you have one of those regular just pop open ironing tables, you know how they have that metal grate underneath? If you take off the layers of the cover on that, usually it's such a thin batting, and I have found in the past that they are like synthetic batting, so they don't hold up a lot for sewists, right? People that press a lot of fabric. It's kind of like for people to press their clothes here and there, you know, once a week or something. If you're really, really pressing fabric, those don't tend to hold up good. And you know what I'm talking about if you have ever been there and kind of put all your weight on it, and then you look at the fabric and it has that metal grated, almost embossed texture to your fabric. You need a buffer in there. You need more layers of a cotton or a cotton batting. You need something a little bit stiffer. I have found that even that thin metal grate, it just gives over time, and it doesn't allow it to stay like this stiff, okay, for what we want for when we're pressing our seams and fabric. Okay. Okay, so as quilters, this is typically what we do. We will press just as it was sewn. So I'm going to press my stitches the same way it was sewn. I'm going to zoom in a little bit because I use gray thread and I don't even think y'all can see it. Boop, boop, boop. Maybe there you can see a little bit of my stitches right there. So I press it first just as it was sewn. That just helps kind of set the thread there. And I am using a cotton thread, but this also works with a polyester thread, with a synthetic. Now keep in mind that I'm working with cotton fabric, cotton thread on a cotton fabric covered pressing board. So I have it set to the hottest setting, okay? So now if this was a patchwork block, okay, we would say, okay, I want to press to the darker fabric. I would lift up the darker side like this. And I'm going to come in here with the point of my iron to get all that fabric out and press that seam allowance towards the direction of the darker fabric, let's say. After I press it with the iron, as soon as I take it off, I hit it with my clapper for about 5 to 7 seconds or so. And the way that this wooden tailor's clapper works is that, first of all, it's made out of a hard wood. So the grain is really nice and tight, where the steam, the moisture, granted, I don't have any steam in this right now, but you could do the same thing that I mentioned earlier, is spritz this with water, hit it with the heat of the dry iron to create that steam, and leave it there for a few seconds. So after you've created that steam, the tailor's clapper is basically trapping that steam and heat in there. Okay, it's absorbing it while it's holding it down at the seam, and so it's taking the fabric now from hot to cool, and it just allows that seam to be nice and flat. So when I remove this from there, I mean, it is the flattest seam ever. And if you look on the back side, you can see that even this this is a hair over 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I went a little bit narrow, but you can see how flat it is, okay? It's just perfect. I mean, If you've ever pressed a seam and have seen like, why I keep pressing it and the fabric is like bubbling, or I know I sewed straight, but when I press it, the seam doesn't look straight, it's in the pressing. You want it to be flat and crisp, and you can see that on my surface, when I put the iron down, my ironing board here doesn't give, it doesn't allow the fabric to flex. It allows me to sandwich the stiff surface underneath with the flat metal sole plate of the iron, and it's just crunching that seam and that fabric right in the middle, nice and flat. Then we come in with that wooden tailor's clapper and just set everything in place as it starts to cool down, okay? Now, I had pressed that seam in one direction. With the other sample here, let's do the same thing. We press it just as it was sewn. And then I'm going to go ahead and open the seam. This is where I think you can really see it. For those of you that are quilters, if you've never pressed a seam open before with a tailor's clapper, this is like a dream seam, okay? To then go back in and have intersecting seams when they're flat and open like this, it's just an absolute dream. Okay, so I'm gonna come in here. You see how that is? It's not flat at all. It's standing up. Even if you finger crease it, it still wants to pop up, okay? I'm gonna take my little mist bottle. I'm just gonna give it a little spritz, and we do carry these in the shop. Then I'm gonna take the heat of my iron, okay? And I'm making steam, the heat plus the spray of water that I just added. And now I'm gonna hit it with my tailor's clapper for 5 to 7 seconds. Oh, this is like one of the most satisfying things. I already know what it's gonna look like when I remove this, and it's one of my favorite things ever to see my seams look like this. I mean, it almost looks like the fabrics are fused to their wrong side, okay? Do you see how crispy that is? It's not going anywhere. It's not gonna keep like standing all the way up on you. I mean, even if I lift it, you can see that when I let it goes down pretty flat, okay? On the other side, oof, if you sew, you know what I mean. Like, it's just like, ah, so proud of my work. So proud of my tailor's clapper for doing all the work for me, okay? So for me, at least, the hotter the iron, especially when I'm dealing with cotton, the hotter the iron and a tailor's clapper combo, that is just gonna give me the most perfect seams ever, okay? And this applies to quilting, small pouch projects, bag making, all those little gift items that I be doing tutorials for, like the little gift card holder and this and that. Y'all know what I'm talking about. All those projects, I use my tailor's clapper. So now when it comes to garments, let's go ahead and grab a couple of knits. You can imagine that because we're working with cotton fabric, if I was making a button-down top or something with a lightweight cotton or linen fabric, you would use it the same way. Obviously, you would have to apply some type of finishing techniques to the raw edges, because we all know that cotton fabrics like this will fray, okay? When we're working with the stretch knit fabrics, it's a little bit different. So this fabric I have here, you can see how drapey and light it is, or lightweight, I should say. This is a rayon jersey. So this is a blend of rayon, some polyester, and spandex, okay? So if this was a top, and you can see that this would be a really flimsy little either dress or top or something. If you needed to hem the bottom edge of a t-shirt like this, first let's go ahead and I'm going to drop the temp a little bit to like a wool silk setting. I don't really go all the way down to synthetic. I find that at least on my T-fall irons, the synthetics I use at least tend to be able to go a little, take more heat than setting it all the way to the lowest setting of synthetic. I want it to have a little bit more heat than that. You just got to be mindful of like not leaving it on there. And of course, if you're working with a fabric that's new to you, just test it out on a scrap piece and leave it on there and see like how much can it take before you start melting the fabric, okay? Yes, Jacqueline says, I love, love, love my tailor's clapper. It's a sewing life changer. It absolutely is. So I want you to see how it works now on stretch knits, okay? So if this was a hem and I needed to turn it under by some amount, let's say this is about 1 inch. One other thing you can do too is, just to be extra careful if you have it on a really high setting, is place like a cotton press cloth over top of it. You can even hit that with the water so that the steam can still be created with the heat of the dry iron and have it go through. Because what I have on top is a cotton fabric, it's just like drying the moisture and it's putting the steam through down, through to the layer that's underneath. So if I go like this, I can just leave that cotton fabric right there and still use my clapper to press the seam. So if I do a long chunk like this, I literally will just go like this with the clapper and slide it, hold it a couple seconds, slide it, keep going in whatever the whole area was that I pressed with my iron, okay? So now if I take this off and I open this, I mean, this is red fabric and you can see that crease, y'all. So what I like to do with this is, yes, I'm working with a drapey fabric. It moves, it's flimsy. But because the crease is so crisp, I rarely ever even put pins if I need to go to the sewing machine or to my cover stitch machine to stitch this hem in place because the crease is there. It holds itself in place. So even if this unflaps while I'm at the sewing machine, all I got to do is flip it back and I'm not going to lose the spot because that crease is so prominent. Does that make sense? So instead of having to like fold a little bit, put a pin, fold a little bit, put a pin, fold, you know what I mean? Like you get these crooked, wonky hems that just move on you. If you use that steam like that with a little spray bottle in your iron or water directly using the steam function of your iron, if that works for you and your setup, and this tailor's clapper on a harder surface, you're gonna get creases like this, okay? So for collars, necklines, hems, all that stuff, it's just a dream. Terry says, these are the things that excite us, right? I know, it's so hard because other people just don't get it. So I'm glad that you all do. All right. Oh, yes. Anne says that that's her favorite notion, the mister bottle. It does work great because it doesn't shoot like a hard spray of the water. It's just like a light mist, especially if you just press it lightly. If you squeeze it real hard, you'll get more, obviously. All right. So here, I kind of left this area without being pressed, and you can kind of see how I barely have a crease there, okay? So here was where we pressed it good with the steam, the cotton piece of fabric on top, the heat of the iron, and it wasn't even set to the hottest setting. I have it in wool silk. And then the clapper, and you can kind of see the difference between this and this. This right here will still move on me. I'm likely to have to use some type of a hem tape or a pins to hold that in position. This right here, I can just fold it. It's going to fold right on the crease. All right. So that was a rayon jersey. And if you have ever worked with this stuff, you know it can be a nightmare. So use your clapper because it can definitely help. Oh my gosh. PJ says my clapper is like an extension on my left hand, of my left hand. That is hilarious. I love it. And you see me, sometimes I'm like, I'm going to press this. And I literally have it here. Like I go to grab it to press it again and again. It really is satisfying, especially when you reveal it. All right, so here I have a 95% cotton with a 5% spandex blend. This springs back because it has that spandex in it. It doesn't just stay stretched out. It has good bounce back or stretch recovery. I call it bounce back because it bounces back into its original shape. And so the same thing for this. If I made a t-shirt or some leggings or shorts or whatever loungewear, and let me turn it this way, it looks like a straighter edge, and I wanted to hem it again, you would turn it up, and I'm going to do something different here. And this iron is still set to like the wool silk setting. I'm going to press this here into place, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if I leave it there and I open it, because it has mostly cotton, you can still see that crease line there. But I tell you what happens when I've done this and I don't use the clapper. If you're like pressing this area, then you're going back and turning the fabric, you know, say you're sewing up the side seams of a shirt and you're moving it over time, I find that it's just like the fabric cools off a little bit and it doesn't hold the crease as well as I would have liked by the time I get to the sewing machine to do that step. So when I do the clapper, let's hit it. And this is mostly cotton, so I don't need to use a cotton piece on top. I'm not worried about messing up the fabric with the heat of this iron, even though it's not on the hottest setting. Let's do that again. We have the steam there. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I'm going to hit it with the clapper. Ooh, and my clapper covers almost my whole little piece here. So we'll hold it there a few seconds. And then when I open it up, the crease is so pronounced that it almost wanted to stay up when I went to open it. You see that? I think that's a big difference. And even if visually, if it doesn't feel like it is to you, in your hands as you're working on these projects, it's a huge difference. Because that crease right there is not going anywhere as I work with the project. It really is in place. I don't have to worry about putting pins now to hold it there while I go back in and turn the fabric and, you know, stitch down the side seams and do other stuff. When you do that, you know that oftentimes you can pinch yourself with the pins that are there waiting for you for a future step. And so this allows me to just leave it like that and know that with that clapper set seam, it ain't going nowhere. Okay? So, I mean, this thing is a game changer for synthetics, for natural fiber fabrics like cotton, linen, all that stuff. I mean, on a linen, set a crease with this thing on a linen. It's never gonna come out. It just is like so crispy. All right, let's see. Oh, Debbie says, now I'm convinced I need a clapper. You need one, you need one, you need one, Debbie. And at first you look at it and you're like, what is this piece of wood that they keep using? And then you try it and you're like, psh, mind blown, gotta have it. Let's see. Oh, awesome. Hi, Lonnie. My first WIP Wednesday, and you taught me something. The tailor's clapper. Yay. Awesome. Thanks for tuning in. I'm glad you were able to make your first WIP Wednesday. Rosalie is asking, will you get the same effect with a wool pressing mat and the clapper? Yes. Just keep in mind if it's a really good quality, because that's another thing. I've seen different wool mats. Some of them are thin and they're a little bit more pliable. They have like more give. If you can get the really expensive ones, those have way more wool in them. They're thicker and they're sturdier. They hold up better. And so that's going to give you what I'm trying to do here with the wooden, the ironing surface that I made by wrapping this piece of wood in cotton batting, a couple layers, some cotton fabric on top. You want a surface that's as hard as you can get it, really, is what I prefer. If you find that your seams maybe move on you when you go to press them and set them with the clapper, check to see that you don't have an ironing surface that you're pressing on that's a little bit too malleable, I would say. The harder this is, the better, because if this is hard, you're adding the heat, the steam, then this is hardwood and you're setting it there. I mean, you really are just like cramming in that crispy flat shape to your seams, okay? And this also works great on your seam intersections on multiple patchwork pieces. Try it. If you're pressing seams open because you have a lot of seams from your blocks meeting in one spot, press them open, set each one individually with the clapper, and then you'll see that when you go to sew the next row or the next block to it, it just makes it so much more enjoyable to stitch through those layers, okay? Awesome. Let's see. Ooh, Star says, I have a 50-year-old well-used clapper thanks to a very good tailor teacher she had in high school. She says she's still using it every sewing lesson. Absolutely. Okay. And Kathy's asking what kind of finish is on the clapper. It is just sanded down smooth. It doesn't have anything on it. Like there's no oil finish or anything like that, because you don't want that stuff on your fabric either. And it doesn't have any chemicals either, because you don't want to be heating that stuff up and breathing it in while you're working with it. So it's just a piece of hardwood. If you are handy or you have someone handy nearby and you have some hardwood, consider making yourself one. Even if you just make like just a rectangle stick to try it out, it's a game changer for sure. But if you want to get your hands on these Jackson Woodworks ones, we have them in our online shop in stock, okay? And Nancy says that the clapper definitely helped her when she was making bags. So if you only sew quilts and you think, I don't need a clapper, or you only sew clothes and you feel the same way, if you sew clothes, bags, quilts, or you want to branch out into other stuff, this is going to be a game changer. Because you know, if you press a seam after you've sewn some pieces of fabric together and it's not exactly right, we still have more seams to go in the construction process of that project. So if the first seams are not well set, you start to run into issues down the line when you're trying to make that first seam match a second one, match a third one. So definitely worth its weight in gold. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Perfect. Kathy says that her clapper is her best friend when she's pressing 1/4-inch hems for holiday napkins. I would have to agree. And that's another great tip. The same way that I shared with you all here, this super, super scant and narrow seam, I pressed it over to the side. I want you to see that something as narrow as this, and I know I said 1/4 inch, but this is not 1/4 inch. This is like a chunky 1/8 inch. It's really narrow. If I press this seam open, I want y'all to see, if you have tricky projects that you haven't had good results with in the past because the seams just were like going one way or the other, you couldn't get them to do what you wanted to, I think right here you'll see it. This is about 1/8 inch on each side. If you have narrow seams like this, who mentioned it? Somebody that just mentioned it on the napkins, Kathy did. If you have that like that, it really just helps the fabric behave in those situations where you're like tweaking a super, super narrow seam or hem or whatever it may be. And again, I use it for both, for natural fiber fabrics as well as synthetics and blends of the two also. All right, so here goes with like an eighth of an inch seam allowance. So you know that if you tried to do that without the clapper and an iron, you'd probably, one, burn your fingertips. So you need those little silicone covers for your fingertips. And look at that, how crispy and flat it is on both sides with that narrow of a seam allowance. I mean, it really is a game changer. And it's hard to really like explain. I'm trying to show you here and hopefully it comes across. But once you get one, remember me and send me a message. You can thank me later. All right. Okay, so that was it. I went over ironing surface tips, different things that you can do and how I cover mine. So if you're tuning in late, make sure that you watch the video again from the beginning because we started off with that. Then we talked a little bit about irons, steam options, whether in the iron or using the spray mist bottle as well, and then the setting tools, which my number one setting tool is the small tailor's clapper that we carry in our online shop. The size of it is perfect. The grooves on the side help you grab it, and the length of it is not too long, but it does allow you to press nice big chunks of seams or hem allowances all at once. And let me actually grab my little ruler here and measure it for y'all so you can see. This one measures just shy of 7 3/4 inches long. Okay, so in case you were wondering. Super, super handy. I hope that you all learned something today with my tips about irons and pressing mats and pressing your seams, whether you're making garments, clothes, garments are clothes, garments, bags, quilts, or whatever it is that you're working on. Definitely take out your tailor's clapper. And for those of you that have one in your stash but rarely use it, bring it out again. You will definitely be glad that you did. Okay? So thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. Those of you that joined us live, I appreciate your comments. Go ahead and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and make sure to check out the featured tab on the CraftyGemini.com shop page if you want to find out where you can get your hands on any of the items that I featured here today. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in, and I will see y'all next week. Enjoy your weekend.